You're listening to BBC Radio 5 Live. I am Laura McGee. We will return to the phone in just a moment. But I want to bring you an interview now, because new research from the Yorkshire Building Society shows that repurposing vacant buildings could deliver up to 2.6 million additional homes, which is nearly double the government's 1.5 million new build target. Across the UK, 748,000 homes are standing empty and unused. Offices, retail and industrial spaces could provide more than 275,000 homes. Compared with new builds, repurposing empty properties is faster, it's cheaper and more sustainable, costing as little as £20,000 per home and contributing £4 to the local economy for every £1 spent. The bank worked with the Centre for Policy Studies on this analysis, and Emma Revel, the Director of External Affairs for the think tank, joined me a little earlier. She started by explaining how the problem of empty spaces is constantly exacerbating the housing crisis that Britain is facing.
If you compare the sort of ratio of people to homes between Britain and sort of major Western European economies, we're actually 6.5 million homes short of that ratio. And that is just getting worse every day, really, with the scale of migration. So nothing is really being done effectively to tackle this, and that's why Yorkshire Building Society are calling for reuse and repurposing of existing property to be considered alongside new builds as a way to solve the housing crisis.
I'm interested to find out how we get to that headline number of 2.6 million additional homes.
So it's a breakdown of a number of different things. It's starting with nearly 750,000 existing empty properties, which Yorkshire Building Society say can be brought back into use often for as little as £20,000 of investment, which is obviously a massive saving on when you compare it to building a new home from scratch. It's repurposing things like car parks, which they say will generate about 100,000 homes. It's 130,000 properties they think can be brought into use from existing government and NHS buildings that aren't being used and sort of sat empty. And then another sort of 270,000-ish from empty shops, bringing people closer, being able to live closer to the high street and injecting life back into those. And then the rest, about 1.4 million, is looking at brownfield sites along railways. So there's a huge chunk of land that sits along England's railways, incredibly well connected to major town and city centres, to jobs and that sort of thing. And that land could be used to generate a significant number of new homes as well.
To me, who is by no means an expert in anything to do with this, it seems quite simple to me. It seems quite obvious that using existing properties would be a good idea if they're sitting empty anyway. But is it cheaper to use or to repurpose an existing property than to just build a whole big area's worth of new builds?
It is usually cheaper. It costs, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds to build new property. It's very expensive to do. And repurposing, if you take empty homes, for example, bringing those back up to standard and making them available to buy or rent can be as cheap as £20,000 worth of investment. If you're looking at something like taking an empty office block that doesn't need to be used anymore because people are moving from, working from home, and that office space isn't needed on the same scale, there would be different levels of investment required for that. And it's not about picking reuse and repurpose over new builds and pitting them against each other. What Yorkshire Building Society would like to see is a strategy to make it easier and more quicker when it comes to planning reform for reuse and repurposing to be considered. Because at the minute, the focus is on new builds, and the numbers that we're seeing, unfortunately, just are not meeting the demand that we need.
In a very simplistic way, can we just build more homes without having to look at infrastructure, or is infrastructure key when it comes to building new properties?
Infrastructure is key, but a lot of what we can, the land where we could build new homes or the brownfield sites that have been identified by the report, they are well connected already. There's lots of space in our towns and city centres that is not being used for its initial purpose. It's sitting empty or it's sitting derelict. We could be repurposing lots of that. And because it's already in towns and city centres, the infrastructure is already there. If you're looking at a whole new build development or massively expanding, say, on the edge of a town or the edge of a city, then yes, new infrastructure is something that needs to be prioritised. But in a lot of cases, the infrastructure is already there.
I know for some people, being able to buy their own home would be the most important thing to them. It would be their biggest priority in life. But I wonder, generally, do we think that Brits would be happy with the idea of living in what was an office block or what was a car park?
Well, I think people, as you say, are struggling with the incredibly high cost of housing, whether that's renting or trying to save up to get on the housing ladder. And the more properties we have available, the more affordable housing becomes. The reason that we have a housing crisis in the UK is that we do not have supply to meet demand. As I said at the start, we're about 6.5 million homes short of where a lot of our, the ratios that a lot of our comparable European neighbours would see. If that gap was a lot smaller, everything would be a lot more affordable. And I think people would love to live, in what used to be a car park or an abandoned office block. It would be much more attractive to people, even if you don't live in them, to see, flats being lived in and people contributing to the economy rather than just looking at an empty building.
Yeah, of course. And some people love a bit of character around their house as well. So maybe that would be something they would enjoy. In terms of the opportunities for repurposing these spaces, how evenly spread are they across the country?
Well, as you might expect, quite a lot of the office space is concentrated in London because a lot of the economic value of the country is concentrated in the capital. But there is a significant distribution around the country. Nearly 1 million square metres of office space in the northwest, for example, that have been identified that Yorkshire Building Society estimate could be about 9,000 flats or 6,500 homes. So it's not just a London issue, and depending on where and what type of building, it could be turned into, a significant number of units per building. And these are available across the country.
That was Emma Revel, the Director of External Affairs for the think tank Centre for Policy Studies. Thanks to Emma for joining us a little bit earlier. You are listening to BBC Radio 5 Live.